Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Before we begin this afternoon's discussion, I would just like to have you pay attention to a brief safety message from the facilities management. Thank you. Good evening again. My name is Malini Maharaj. I am an assistant lecturer with the Department of Economics at UE St. Augustine. We would like to welcome everyone here on behalf of the department and thank you for your participation. This forum is an annual event, also representing the outreach of the department to our national community to discuss issues that affect us all. The forum is also part of the Dimas Rampersad series, which offers several similar discussions based on current impactful economic issues throughout the year. To begin this discussion on the 2019-2020 national budget, we have a distinguished panel consisting of Dr. Regan Deonanan, Dr. Dave Seerattan, and Dr. Daren Conrad. Dr. Regan Deonanan is also a lecturer with the Department of Economics here at UE St. Augustine. He specializes in developmental economics as well as international financial flows. Dr. Dave Seerattan is an economist studying Caribbean emerging economies for over 20 years, particularly the financial sector in these economies. He has researched and published in areas such as financial innovations, financial regulations, financial microstructure, etc. Dr. Daren Conrad is also a lecturer at the Department of Economics, specializing in the areas of education, manpower planning, and urban and regional development. After I begin and remind you about some of the key highlights from the budget, each speaker will present for about 15 minutes each, and after all of the presentations, we invite you, the members of the audience, to join in the discussion, making comments, asking questions, and engaging us in deliberating the effectiveness of this year's national budget. So to briefly remind you what was said on Monday, I know as economists, we tend to anticipate the budget as some, physics or astronomers anticipate a solar eclipse. That's what the budget means for us. And I think Monday was quite an exciting time for us to be able to sit down and deliberate and see how our economy is moving, the direction in which we expect to be moving towards, and what essentially is being done to attempt to achieve the developmental agendas that we all wish and hope for. So as economists, again, we start looking at the financial flows, the finances, the money, what's happening with our current state. As you can see, we have had very minimal changes in our revenue projections from last year's national budget and this year's national budget, and also a minimal increase in total expenditure. Fiscal debt as well would have increased by a minimal amount when compared to last year's budgeted fiscal debt, that is. The composition of total revenue as well is consistent with oil revenue increasing and non-oil revenue also increasing by minimal amounts. Capital revenue, however, decreased substantially from over 3 billion, an estimated 3 billion last year, to less than 1 billion this year. And we could perhaps discuss why and how that could have happened. Sectoral expenditures remain consistent, with education and training, national security and health receiving the majority of allocations. Agriculture, once again, received the smallest of sectoral expenditure allocations. Some of the measures that would have been introduced under each sector, you have manufacturing, the proposal of special economic zones, the value-added tax bonds that I think would be an interesting point to highlight, and the possible impacts of having these bonds on business and on the private sector. For agriculture, there was the removal of taxes and duties on all inputs in that attempt to make agriculture a tax-free industry. For tourism, the proposal of the establishment of the terminal building at the A&R Robertson International Airport, as well as the fast ferries for re-establishing the connectivity between Trinidad and Tobago, that sea bridge. Other fiscal measures under infrastructure were quite a few. So there was mention of an accelerated housing program, the development of several sectoral infrastructures, industrial, fishing, maritime, etc., as well as health infrastructures. In terms of institutional capacity, the budget mentioned increasing functions and roles for the Trinidad and Tobago Revenue Authority, the continuation of the property tax and the procurement bill from 2020 as well. Of particular interest to the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago would have been these measures in particular, because these are the ones that most average citizens would be concerned about and would be affected by, most directly that is. So they would have spoken about the changes in minimum wage, the 15% increases in CPEP and URP wages, the increase in on-the-job training numbers as well as incentives. And I must also mention, quite impressively, certain policies related to the environment, which is something that we tend not to see highlighted in many budgets, but they did mention the banning of styrofoam and other initiatives related to energy and renewable energy. So with this very brief reminder, at least to have your memory refreshed about what might have been mentioned on Monday, I would like to invite our first panelist, Dr. Regan Deonanan, to offer his contributions. Please welcome Dr. Deonanan.
Good afternoon, everybody. Okay, it's a pleasure to be here with you all at this Demas Ramsad Seminar Series, where we, as Ms. Maharaj mentioned, this is really a discussion forum. So I am going to, my area is developmental economics. You would have heard a bit of a backdrop of some of the main things mentioned within the budget. What I want to do today is just give you a few thoughts from my field, macroeconomic development, things as I listen to the budget, how I view the budget, and some of the things that stand out as areas that we need to consider moving forward. All right. So when I listen to the budget, when you consider the landscape of the downturn beyond just this year, but going back a few years now, I think that one of the major concerns of our citizens out there, and certainly for me as an economist, is this issue of jobs. When you talk to the person on the street, when there's the issue of layoffs, there are companies that are closing, contracting, reductions in workforce. So to the everyday person out there seems to be a significant issue with respect to layoffs, and there's a fear associated with that. When we hear downturn, we hear these fears concerning layoffs. But to be clear as well, it's not just a matter of jobs in terms of layoffs. There are many people looking for jobs beyond just those who have been laid off. People who are transitioning, trying to get different opportunities to develop within their own careers. And in periods like this, sometimes anecdotally you hear that it's hard to find those types of opportunities. And certainly for new graduates, UE being included, but graduates from different types of programs, opportunities to gain experience, to gain training, and to get on to a career track. So from an everyday perspective, and when I listen to the budget, what is at the back of my mind, what echoes at the back of my mind, is where are the jobs coming from? We have these significant declines, and when we look at the budget, does it hold some type of promise? Does it hold some sense of where this might be coming from and how we address this type of issue? But I want to also mention it's not just about jobs. When I think about it as a developmental economist, it's not just about whether you gain employment for a short period of time, but I mention here sustainable jobs that you can build a career out of. And that is a focus, because sustainable jobs within any economy has ripple implications beyond just the individuals involved. Certainly we care about the individuals involved, and we want sustainable jobs for them, for every member within our society. But sustainable jobs, the benefits arise and accrue to at a national level, much beyond just those individuals alone, has implications for the quality of human capital overall, and human capital is a basis for development. So if you have something that's affecting the quality and the breadth of human capital, you're affecting long-run development. Sustainable jobs, career-oriented jobs also have to do with quality of institutions. And these are major factors, precursors, preconditions, depending on what school of thought you come from, things that help long-run economic development. So when you talk about sustainable jobs, you're not just talking about those individuals, but you're talking about development of the economy moving forward in the long term, and setting up a good framework for those things to happen. So not just those individuals involved. This is how I look at the budget. This is the lens through which I look at the budget. And to give you an idea of the numbers, and certainly I know many people here involved in the economics field, and certainly would share with me the sentiment that we don't have enough data we don't have current data enough to tell us to give us an accurate picture of what's going on. Nonetheless, here the data that I do have and I present to you here is from the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, and the latest figure in the central bank data goes up to 2017. I mean, we're into 2019, but I'm talking about 2017 figures here. But if you look at the graph, and just to give you an idea historically, right? And I know what we have on the x-axis here, we have the year. And what we have here on the vertical axis is a total employed in thousands. And I know you probably can't see the date, but allow me to point out that from about this period here, right, that declined, that was the total unemployed. Now this is the level. This is not a rate. This is the number in thousands. And so what you see is a prolonged period of decline there. And that prolonged period of decline meaning lower and lower unemployment numbers, happened and coincided with the boom in this economy from roughly the late 90s to 2007, 2008, in that period. So we saw employment rising. We saw greater labor force, number of people in the labor force increasing, and you saw more people being employed there. So we made tremendous gains. Coming out of that boom, we made gains in terms of the number of people being employed. Right? But what has happened in the later period here, and again this is up to 2017, but in this, there was here, which corresponds to 2015, then we have this bottoming out, right? And then it starts going back up, meaning that we have the number of total unemployed increasing. Unemployment then is increasing. And you can't really see from the graph here, apologies, but this is in the order of about, in terms of the minimum to 2017, it's about a 9,000 difference in terms of the number of jobs. Now this is official data, but the official data, and we recognize that the official data certainly doesn't tell us all that's going on. There's the shadow economy and the losses in those sectors, and then there's a lot that is unrecorded as well. So you should think about these numbers as a minimum. So when we talk about the concerns of our jobs, the data also says, at least to me, says that there is a concern there when we talk about the numbers, unemployment rates rising. So again, I'm showing you these numbers here to underscore the fact, why I look at this through the lens of job creation, right? And there are two major points I want to share with you and discuss with you guys today in and around this idea of job creation and how we move forward. The first of all is, I think we need a greater focus on foreign direct investment. All right, so let me give you a little bit of picture of why, and then we'll talk about how this relates to the budget. All right, benefits of increased foreign direct investment, increased tax base. A lot of, we've heard over and we've seen over successive budgets in terms of the numbers being presented that the income from oil revenue, the income to the government, that has decreased. And that is an important factor because it limits the ability of the government to provide jobs. The government has been a major employer in this national economy. And then the other sectors that depend on the government, those expenditures have also decreased. So we have job losses as a result of the intake from government decreasing. Foreign direct investment has the benefit. If you're able to attract foreign companies to your country, to your economy, can have immediate effects in terms of increasing the tax base, can help with respect to unemployment there. Provide capital. As small island developing states, as small countries, sometimes we lack access to capital. Sometimes we've heard in different periods that we don't have enough capital to develop certain sectors. Well, foreign direct investment can help in that sense as well. And also there's the immediate employment opportunities by companies that come here, as well as the sectors that result from foreign direct investment. But the reason I'm highlighting foreign direct investment here is because these are the usual factors that are usually given for why one would want to consider foreign direct investment. But I think the one that is not given enough attention, and the reason that I'm highlighting it here, is this last point about learning, exposure to new technologies, techniques, exposure to global value chains. Foreign direct investment in the literature and within the development field is much, much more than just providing capital and providing some jobs and providing those kind of things. Foreign direct investment is really how you educate a country. For countries who have limited resources that don't spend enough on foreign direct on research and design, on research in general, and we certainly fall into that case. For countries who lack a great variety of products and are trying to get into new markets and new types of products, foreign direct investment is like schooling. It's like an education in that field. So it's not just about the capital, but it is the opportunity that comes along with the exposure to new firms. And those opportunities have to do with being exposed to new technologies. We get to learn alongside somebody else who's using that new technology. That is important. It's not just about being able to buy the technology, but it's being aware of what is the best, how to use it, and how to apply it. More than that, even if you produce something from it, it's about accessing global value chains, and that's learning by doing. Foreign direct investment is much more than capital, right? So it's a basis for, it certainly is complementary in some cases, necessary in others, efforts to increasing non-energy exports. This is related to trends and themes that we have seen in the budget, and if one goes beyond just the budget, but to the work that different ministries are doing, even the Ministry of Trade, you'll see a focus on increasing non-energy exports. That is a major focus, at least in terms of what is said and what is planned to be a focus. How we achieve that, however, I'm proffering within my field, foreign direct investment is an important factor in achieving that. And I don't think that we, in looking at our landscape, beyond just the budget, but looking at our landscape, for a number of years, this goes back a number of years, we haven't focused enough on foreign direct investment. But I'll give you some glimpses from the data so you can tell for yourself. Right? So again, a graph here, and I didn't anticipate it being this small. Right? What I have here is data for foreign direct investment in US millions. Right? Again, the source is the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago. And the span here starts from 1990 all the way to 2018. Right? And so if you look at this point here, you'll see generally foreign direct investment trending upwards, right? That period, as we were describing before, that's the 90s. That's the late 90s coming up to the 2000s. That was prior to the boom, and that was the investment leading up to the boom and during the boom period. So we see that during that boom period, you had foreign direct investment increasing, right? In 2008, which corresponds to that peak over there, that's not really a spike in foreign direct investment, at least the usual foreign direct investment. That was really the acquisition by RBC of some assets in RBTT. So that was a one-off transaction that happened in that year. So if you subtract off that point, the picture that you get during the boom period, you have foreign direct investment increasing, and it's not coincidental that along with that foreign direct investment, you had job creation and a lot of different things, good things happening within the economy. In the late 2000s, we saw that decline. That's where you started seeing that decline gone negative, and negative simply suggested that foreign direct investments, the profits weren't being reinvested into organizations, and they were transfers between companies, across companies. And then we see a slight uptick, and then for the later period, from 2014 onwards, we have significant declines. So this axis, by the way, is 0, right? So there are points there we're hovering close to 0, and then we went even, in the later periods, we're below the 0 level in terms of the level of FDI, right? So this is what has been happening with respect to FDI. FDI has decreased and gone negative in most recent years, right? To add to that picture, so while we were successful at attracting FDI during the boom period, and then there's a subsequent decline, but even in the boom period, in the period, let's say 1997 to 2007, that accounted for roughly petroleum FDI, or petroleum-related FDI, accounted for 90% of the total FDI flow that I had on there, right? The lesson here, and the lesson from my field, foreign direct investment that is fostered corresponds to the sector that develops. And when you look historically at us, that's what we have been attracting, that we have seen the benefits coming out of that. But we have 90% of the foreign direct investment during that period came from, in 1997 to 2007, was to the petroleum sector. So it's not surprising that when you see the landscape out there in terms of the sectors that are developed or underdeveloped, well, you can sort of predict that by the level of FDI. Remember my statement before, which is that this foreign direct investment is an education. It's exposure. We have been educating ourselves, being exposed to pretty much one type of foreign direct investment. And we've seen that sector develop, but what it also means is that we haven't seen other sectors develop, and I prefer because we have not had that focus in other areas, but certainly in FDI in those sectors. Right? So FDI to the energy sector has enabled greater capacity and accompanied high employment levels. That focus is important, and you see elements within the budget, there are measures there to continue the focus into attracting new forms of foreign direct investment into the energy sector. This is not a story about not doing that. We need to continue that. So those measures are good. But what, in my story here, that I offer is we need to go beyond that. If we say we want to develop other sectors and therefore sustainable jobs coming from other sectors, you need to focus on different forms of FDI. All right? All right. Okay, I think I'm out of time. I want to mention the other thing that I, within I mentioned two thoughts there. If ever, I don't have a graph of it here, but Trinidad and Tobago is among one of the largest consumers of energy and one of the largest emitters of carbon dioxide in the region. What this means to us as developmental economists is that renewable energy and that industry, there are tremendous opportunities in terms of impacting where we are in the energy landscape as well as environmental sustainability domestically. Let's not even talk about export capacity and all those kind of things, right? We heard measures in the budget, for instance, LED light bulbs, promoting LED light bulbs. And while there weren't too many details, for instance, and while that's good, it's noteworthy, it's good in the sense of reducing energy consumption and emissions as well. But I proffer that this area is a formidable area that we need to grapple with, both in terms of our consumption levels as well as our energy emissions, energy consumption and emissions. I think there's greater opportunity there, and we need to develop that sector, both for domestic personal reasons, but in terms of globally as well in the development economics field. This is a very important sector. And if we don't develop that sector now, I think we are running a risk of becoming a latecomer in that is being developed in many of the Caribbean countries as well. Sustainable jobs, that sector is really important. I'm out of time, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Deonanan, for highlighting the importance of foreign direct investment in particularly affecting sustainable employment, and in this last case as well, establishing that energy, environment, and economy interaction. I would like to now invite Dr. Seerattan to offer his thoughts on the national budget.
Okay, a pleasant good afternoon to everyone. I see people have made it here despite the inclement weather. What I want to do today really is just to focus on some broad thematic issues that are going to impact on our development this year and in the future. A lot of the very difficult decisions that the Minister of Finance will have, whoever he or she is, will have to make in the future, of course, wasn't made in this budget. As we all know, next year is an election, and therefore the political economy considerations would have driven a lot of the decision-making that went into this particular budget. But there are some interesting issues that even this budget we have to take into account. It was mentioned earlier that expenditure would have gone up for the first time by about about 2.5 billion is projected to increase in this fiscal year relative to the last year. And that has some implications for the performance of the Trinidad and Tobago economy, because we have serious challenges on the fiscal side as well as on the foreign exchange market side, which means that we have serious challenges on our level of international competitiveness. But on the fiscal challenges side, there are some serious things that we need to take into account. We have been running a budget deficit of roughly 5 to 6 billion for the last 4.5 years, and that has certain implications for the foreign exchange market and for incomes generally in the economy. The fact that the minister has now sought to increase the amount of expenditure might be related to election considerations, but I think he and others have recognized that there is a certain limit beyond which, if you go below expenditure, it is going to have a perverse negative effect on the economy. So I think we have reached the limit to the extent to which we could cut, for example. So in moving forward, we really have to look and focus on where we can increase revenues. So the adjustment going forward, I think, will have to focus more on the revenue side rather than the expenditure side, because we are already seeing certain stresses and strains in the society generally because of the cutbacks that we have had in the last 4 years or so. Now, in this respect, the minister would have mentioned the whole issue about the Revenue Authority. Now, the fact that the latest tax amnesty we had raised about $2.2 billion suggests that there are significant improvement in our revenue that we could actually generate if we were to get our act together in terms of the administration of the tax system in Trinidad and Tobago. And I know this is a politically sensitive issue, but the whole idea of a revenue authority is nothing new. This would have been something that has been discussed by the Trinidad and Tobago Authority and the International Monetary Fund across different political regimes. And therefore, this is something that we need to pay particular attention to going forward, because, as I said before, this could potentially generate added revenues for us without necessarily having to cut expenditure as we have done over the last 4 years. And as I said before, I think that we have reached the limit in terms of how much expenditure we can cut. In that respect as well, another important issue that wasn't particularly mentioned in the budget is the whole issue of expenditure efficiency. I would have done some work about 3 years ago looking at expenditure efficiency in Trinidad and Tobago, using an efficiency frontier type of approach, which kind of measures the efficiency with which government uses public funds to provide different goods and services and so on. And it was very alarming that in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, especially on the infrastructure development side, our input efficiency in those areas was as low as about 20%, which means that for every dollar we spent on the infrastructure side, that was 2014 data, we were actually wasting 80 cents, which in most countries, the input efficiency on the expenditure side is close to 80%, which means you're wasting about 20% of the money that you actually collect. So the point I'm making on going forward in terms of our adjustment, we really have to focus on the revenue side. And if we are doing anything on the expenditure, it has to be about trying to increase the efficiency with which we spend public money and in terms of getting value for money. This government has made some improvements in those areas, but we need a much more structured approach in terms of how we do our budget planning process and in terms of how we evaluate the budgetary process over the medium-term framework, not necessarily from year to year. Right? So those are two things. And on the fiscal challenges side as well, on the fiscal policy side, you have to, when you talk about fiscal, you have inevitably to talk about what is going on with the exchange rate, because this government has made, I think, the correct decision to use fiscal policy to drive most of our adjustment that we have made so far, right? So most of the our adjustment have been through the expenditure side, as I just discussed, and if we are to continue in this, using this strategy, then we will have to make any further improvements on the revenue side. So this is important because the IMF and other interested parties in Trinidad and Tobago have been recommending, putting pressure on the government to allow the exchange rate to be used more intensively in the adjustment process. Meaning that you allow some flexibility on the exchange rate side, and most economists will know if the exchange rate depreciates, automatically governments, the amount of revenue in TT dollars that the government actually could pull in actually goes up. But the problem with using the exchange rate, is, as our neighbors have found out, is that the exchange rate is a very, very difficult thing to control. So the fund wants the government to allow the exchange rate to be a little more flexible, to absorb some of the adjustment costs. But those of us who study foreign exchange market and exchange rates in particular, especially in countries like our own, knows that once you let that genie out of the box, it is very difficult to control. So my preference will be to use something that I actually have control over, which is to use fiscal policy to make the adjustment that we need to make to get the economy back on track. All right? Not to mention the kind of problems we will have in terms of poverty and in terms of people's lack of confidence in the financial services sector. If, for example, just imagine that you had some mutual fund in TT dollars, and all of a sudden the exchange rate depreciated by 100%. And effectively your real value of the money that you saved in the bank was automatically cut in half. That is going to have a serious negative. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I'm just suggesting that in addition to the fact that the exchange rate is something very difficult to control, there are very, very serious negative consequences with using the exchange rate that is going to impact on us, not only during the period when these changes are made, but long into the future in terms of confidence in the economy and the financial services sector, for example. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the whole issue of the weaknesses on the external sector. Trinidad and Tobago, as you know, if you have been reading the financial press in this country, our external reserves have been falling. If you look at the most recent IMF Article 4 consultation, they actually project that our reserves are going to go down to 5.4 months of import cover in 2023. But there's something not right here, because if you look at the external accounts, the balance of payments account in particular, if you look at what they project for the current account of the balance of payments, Trinidad and Tobago have actually done not that badly in terms of, because we have had surpluses on the current account of the balance of payment, except in 2016, right? If you compare Trinidad and Tobago for example, to any other country in the Caribbean, you will see that these countries have been having balance of payments deficits on the current account for almost a decade, which has implications, of course, in terms of the stability of the exchange rate as well as the debt, which we know is a big problem in the Caribbean. So when you look at the balance of payments account, it is not on the current account side or the transaction-based problems that we have that is generating this excess demand for foreign exchange. If you look at the capital account of the balance of payments, as a matter of fact, Regan would have mentioned FDI, that is where some of the problem emerge. So we have a lot of outflows on the capital account for FDI, as well as for other types of investment, such as portfolio flows and so on. So that adds to the argument, for example, that to use the exchange rate to correct the kinds of problems that may be on the investment side is not a wise decision. Okay, so what we need to do on that side is to try to find out why it is that so much of the money is going out. Now, in the case of our banks, Regan mentioned the fact that Republic Bank actually purchased a large Ghanaian bank, so their money actually going out. And over time, you should see some reflows in terms of returns on those equity investments and so on. As of now, we haven't seen that kind of impact on the balance of payments, so we're still in the negative on that side of the balance of payments. But the point is that, especially for the portfolio flows, it may be some indication that there are capital flight going on in the economy. And that means that irrespective of the particular exchange rate policy that you adopt, that is going to continue because that has a much more fundamental factor driving it, which is the whole issue of confidence in the economy, right? And once confidence in the economy is low, and once the agents, both foreign and domestic, have limited confidence in the government ability to turn the economy around, then you're going to see those kinds of things happening. As a matter of fact, if you want to be devil's advocate and you said, well, okay, you agree to the fund recommendation that you allow the exchange rate to be much more flexible, right? Just imagine that the exchange rate went from 6.7993, which has been for a very long time, to double that, to about 14, because that is the kind of estimate that people have said that based on fundamental factors, that's where the rate's supposed to be. Think about what is going to happen. It is not going to deal with our constraints on the foreign exchange market. As a matter of fact, once you experience that depreciation, the agents in the market are going to expect the next time the exchange rate goes to go in the similar direction and a similar magnitude. So it is going to reinforce the negative perceptions in the foreign exchange market, right? And that is exactly what would have happened in Jamaica. People who don't understand history often repeat it, right? That is exactly what happened in the foreign exchange market in Jamaica. In 2000, the Jamaican exchange rate was 43.29 to $1 US. The last count we had is 136 Jamaican dollars to $1 US. So the fund advocating that you use more flexibility in the foreign exchange market, I think, is a non-starter. It is better than what the government has done, which is in effect rationing the supply of foreign exchange to enable us to maintain a certain amount of stability in terms of the price or the foreign exchange rate. And that is the only thing we could do. That's the best course of action now, because as you know, foreign exchange market and flexible exchange rate tend to work well when you are in normal economic conditions. But once you are in a period where you are trying to deal with imbalances and so on, it is very foolhardy for countries to try to use the exchange rate to adjust, because that is going to start a particular process that it is going to be very difficult to control. So in conclusion, a lot of what the Minister of Finance, although it's an election budget, a lot of what he said in talking about the Trinidad and Tobago economy during his budget speech was relatively accurate. So yes, we have relatively low public debt compared to other countries. We have relatively robust levels of foreign exchange reserves. Yes, the fiscal consolidation effort that the government has undertaken over the last 4 years have actually gone some way to correcting some of the imbalances that we have. There are certain things that I think that could have been done. So for example, on the interest rate policy side, I think the central bank could have been much more aggressive in terms of raising rate to ensure that we maintain our a healthy spread relative to the US interest rates, because as you know, if you have a rate that is as low as the US interest rate, and given our risk in terms of the foreign exchange market and the risk of depreciation, people would put more and more money into US dollars and US dollar denominated assets. So ensuring that your interest rate policy maintains that spread between the US interest rates and our domestic interest rate, using the revenue side to make adjustment in the future, and needs to make adjustment. And just remember that a lot of the adjustment that we still have about $5 billion deficit that we have in this budget, and is likely to be in the future. So we need to close that gap, and the most effective way to close that gap is by using revenue measures, and a combination of revenue measures and efficiency enhancing expenditure measures on the government fiscal accounts, and maintaining at all costs the relative stability that we have in terms of the foreign exchange rate. If we do anything to that foreign exchange rate, the minister is now going to have a separate problem, which is trying to control the rate spiraling downwards, which is not something that you would want to wish on your worst enemy. Okay, and I will stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Seerattan, for that engaging contribution. I'm sure in the discussion session that the audience will appreciate some more thoughts with regard to how we are to improve our expenditure efficiency, and also what different forms of revenue capture are in place, and what might be possible to increase our revenues without necessarily increasing the burden of taxation on the population. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Conrad, who would speak to you based on his area of specialization with regard to spatial planning and urban and regional economics. Dr. Conrad.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. I know the inequity of it all. The minister gets 3 hours to talk to us about his plans, and we get 15 minutes to give you our views on his 3-hour delivery. But I will start talking, and when my time is up, I'm sure I'll be alerted. And because I see some of my good colleagues here, I know it's been a long day. Some of them were deep in thought a few minutes ago. But anyway, I will pull up my presentation. But one of the things I wanted to mention is that as economists, oftentimes we get caught up in the numbers, and we start talking about the things that become a fetish: the interest rate, the exchange rate, the fiscal balances. And I'm finding my presentation here. But so we talk about all these things, but we don't acknowledge that there's some opportunities that we miss. And coming on the heels of the conference on the economy for the last day and a half, we need to start thinking differently. And I would like to start by sharing with you 1 or 2 thoughts, and then I will speak a little bit more specific about some of the other things. But one of the challenges we face here is that we start off with great writers, and that's where we end, with great writers. and that applies to our budget as well. So we talk about stability, strength, and growth. But one of the things that came to mind when the budget was being read is short-termism. And this short-termism became very evident to me one day when I was sitting in a room listening to the budget with a group of people, and by the end of the budget, the room was empty. There was a group of people who said, boy, pensionaries, I gone. The next group said, nothing happened with gas, okay, we good, I gone. And the other group said, okay, we ain't no pay increases, all right, I gone. And by the time the budget was done, the room was empty. That is how we listen to the budget. What is in it for me? But we need to start to look at the budget as a planning mechanism. It is a way to get us to the objectives of the Vision 2030, a great plan, but we don't often speak about that. So I'll talk to you a bit about some of the things. Again, repeated in this budget, again, we are going along the same trajectory where the transfers and subsidies are going to still comprise more than half of the government's expenditure. And that has been the case since 2008, so we're continuing along that, and we're thinking that we're making progress by reducing expenditure. But in fact, still half of our expenditure, even though reduced, still goes into transfers and subsidies. We've been running a deficit, okay, but is what we're doing with the money that we borrow in running up that deficit. Debt to GDP ratio continues to climb, and based on the projections by the IMF, it is projected to increase to 109% by 2022. I think we're well on track for that, given our current rate of spending and what we're actually doing. So those are some of the fiscal challenges that we face, and they're ongoing. They don't go away. So again, the concerns presented in the budget, we still have the concerns which have not been addressed. The foreign exchange, that issue still looms. I think it is going to be amplified in short term because we have now we become net importers of fuel, and we know that has to be purchased using our foreign exchange. So again, we have manufacturers and importers of fuel, the company that imports the fuel, although we hear about them generating a profit, but again, we'll see. And we have a weak non-energy sector. So we're still faced with the same challenges year after year. But what I wanted to point is that we've been missing some golden opportunities. In particular, I listened in this budget, and there was a lot of discussion about infrastructural development. So I'm taking a step back from the numbers with the fiscal and whatnot and pointing to some of the things. We talked about an expansion of the road networks. We talked about public transportation. That was mention of that in the budget. There was discussion about the environment. We're talking about the use of the materials in our production process and our consumption as well. We talked about a number of these things. But I don't see it being aligned to a plan. Again, we're coming into the short-termism. And the reason I say that is because that's why I wanted to talk about the spatial dimension. In spatial planning, this is what spatial planning does. It is to achieve optimum organization of use of land resources in order to meet the social, environmental, and economic needs of the present and future generation. That's what spatial development plans do. In addition to which, we have acknowledged, now that means that we should have a spatial development plan. We have a Vision 2030, so then we should have a spatial development plan that also supports what is in the Vision 2030, and then the budget is then supposed to be closely aligned to that. So here is how we do it. Our last spatial development plan, in the Vision 2030, there was the commitment to review the spatial development plan that we had in 2013 with the view to take the best pieces out of it and with the view to move forward in implementing some of these things. Now, what we have actually had is a lot of, and I'm speaking specifically to the expansion of the road networks. What we've actually had in terms of urban growth is a car-led expansion. We have more roads. That's a car-led expansion. And in that car-led expansion, this was acknowledged in the National Spatial Development Plan. It says that residents are often detached. And shopping malls, for example, are built and designed based on the highway network rather than communities, but simply generating extra car miles. How we use our land affects how we do business, the cost of doing business. Take, for example, this afternoon, how many people, as soon as it started to rain heavily, would have left work with the expectation that if I stayed here, I'd be marooned? And that is lost productivity, irretrievably lost. We lose income. We lose man hours. So again, we had a day of heavy rains. What happens on days with heavy rain? Sometimes businesses are unable to open because there's a cleanup. All about how we utilize the land. So there is a challenge that we face, and it was highlighted in this budget to me that we do not have a spatial development plan. What that is supposed to do is to generate economic activity. If we're simply increasing the number of miles we have in terms of paved roads, and mind you, these paved roads, there's a huge outlay for roads. It's very expensive to build roads. That's a huge cost. But there's also an operating and maintenance cost for road networks, which we do not acknowledge. The economic activity that is supposed to be generated as a result of an improved network is going to then be able to offset some of the costs with maintaining these road networks. That is what is supposed to happen. We didn't hear a discussion on that. We talk about community development and healthcare. Road networks are supposed to enable us to access healthcare easily. It is supposed to enable us to do business easier. It's supposed to reduce the cost of doing business. How we have developed our road networks so far, and what I fear with the expansion of the road networks, is that we are going to encounter, which all studies have shown, when you have car-led growth, you simply end up with a number of externalities, which we then have to pay for, i.e. congestion. That increases the cost of doing business. So picture you delivering goods to the supermarket as a supplier, and you spend most of the time in traffic. And given our crime situation, you know what happens now when you're stuck in traffic with a truck full of goods. We've seen it happen. So we need to think about how we utilize our space by way of developing the road networks. There was also discussion of affordable housing. The money that has been allocated, the $300,000 subsidy for individuals for affordable housing, some affordable housing programs. Now, the problems that we face with affordable housing and the problems that we face with informal settlements, which we have almost 400 informal settlements in Trinidad, is because of how we develop the road networks and how we utilize the land. So that, again, is one of the key problems that we have. Because of how we designed our road networks or did not really have a plan, we've created now the problem of housing affordability as well as informal settlements, which leads to other problems, flooding. So now we have to deal with the cost of flood mitigation. We have to deal with all of these other costs, meanwhile generating no economic activity that can take us forward. So that is one of my challenges. One of the other challenges or concerns I had with the budget is the increase in the minimum wage. Now, I don't have this one on here, but one of the spatial development strategies takes into account the schooling as well. Because, again, a road network is supposed to enable easy access to schools, to government services, to private services, all of these different things. So we talked about increasing increasing the wages for CPEP workers is one of them. We talked about increasing the wages for, the pension plans, implementing the pension plans for daily paid workers, a number of different things inside of there. Then we talked about the OJT program, again, because politicians understand that we are short-sighted. So we get happy. Certain groups will be pleased. Daily paid workers, okay, now I have that pension. What was the other group I mentioned? The OJT program. We have some people who have finished school, not able to find jobs. Okay, I've taken care of them. They'll be happy. Increases in the wage earnings of the CPEP and URP workers. Mind you, I did not hear the rationale behind the increase by 15%. Is it that they're more productive? We know how that labor is utilized. Is it that they're more productive? I am certain that there can be ways that we can utilize or engage with this these groups of, or these gangs, worker gangs, in more productive uses. We spend money on operating and maintenance of government properties. We spend money on operating and maintenance of other facilities. Why not train these individuals to do so and engage in some more productive work rather than how we utilize them presently, so that they will then be able to find some sustainable work? We have created the illusion that that is sustainable work, but it is not a sustainable endeavor. Because again, what economic activity does it really generate? It increases my commuting time by 15 to 20 minutes, depending on where the grass is being cut in the morning. But needless to say, it affects a negative impact on economic activity from that standpoint. So certainly, we want to think about how we deal with that. So we had a number of initiatives that we talked about. The port in Togo. We have a port in Port of Spain that can be developed to accommodate. Let's say we can have cruise ships coming in there. But we're not talking about that. We're now talking about a road network that will take us to a port in Togo. So the cost of getting goods to Tobago we have an increased transportation cost. We have a longer haul and those types of things. So I'm wondering, and then we come to coastal protection. We have a challenge with coastal erosion is one of our challenges. We see some chunks in the Southwest Peninsula falling away. So we have challenges with that, and we need to address some of those things. We have finally acknowledged that we need to be mindful of how we use our land in terms of disposing of materials. But on the flip side, have we taken into consideration the full effect of what we're actually doing? I agree, we have to limit the use of, we're talking about the environmental awareness. That was a great call, the limiting the use of the styrofoam and whatnot. Great call. But what is the plan moving forward? To produce those goods with the additives that make them become biodegradable will indeed become more expensive. And when those costs go up, what will happen? We'll not be paying for an increase in food prices, but we'll be paying. We certainly won't go to collect food like this, right? So we have an added cost now where food is concerned. So we have to be very careful. When we implement these things, we have to be very, very careful. And incidentally, the minimum wage issue, I have a problem with the increase of the minimum wage, because the effect of an increase in minimum wage can be quickly eroded with a increase in inflation, quickly eroded. But again, you create the illusion that there's something in it for me. So again, those are some of my concerns moving forward, in that we have not presented a plan, not in the Vision 2030, neither in the budget, that speaks to our spatial dimension and the potential to use our space to generate economic activity that will make us less reliant on the energy sector. That is how it naturally works. It's very organic, instead of just building more roads. And again, I'm going back to the maintenance issue. Sometimes we see, based on the quality of the roads, we know what it means. I mean, driving along, it's not uncommon. One night I stopped and came out to see what fell out from below the car when I went into that trench. But needless to say, we will have those concerns moving forward. So these are some general concerns, again, that I have. And I will speak to them briefly. I have 2 minutes, plus or minus 3. We're economists. Well, if I add another variable in there, we could probably get 4. But human capital innovation, and that is one of the challenges that we have. We're talking about innovation, but we're not seeing the mechanism to facilitate that taking place. As a matter of fact, one of the presentations this afternoon in the code conference spoke to the importance of research and development, and that is where the innovation can come in. But we now have to think about how we're going to work that through the system. We spend on education, we don't invest in education. We need to change the narrative of how we treat with some of these things. Health and wellness, we are good at taking care of persons when they become ill, but we don't have an aggressive preventive health care. So one of our major challenges continues to be non-communicable diseases. So again, we have not spoken to those issues. Subsidies need to be more targeted, and I speak to the housing subsidy. Yes, there is nothing wrong with providing assistance to those individuals who are really unable to afford, but bear in mind that, yes, there are a number of benefits that we can talk about from economic standpoint, direct and indirect benefits, but a house is a private good, and that is my view as an economist. A house is a private good, and so there needs to be either a partnership or all the stakeholders need to be involved in the provision of housing to the lower income households. So it should not be that the government takes the lead on providing housing, nor housing subsidies. Crime reduction. We make allocations and we spend. And the solution is simple. In urban economics, we talk about two things: the probability of being caught and the duration between, or the time between you being caught and the time that justice is served, essentially. So we have a major challenge there. Poverty reduction, that's still a challenge. We still have large levels, relatively large. I think 21% of the population lives in poverty. And then we need to start thinking about returning to a savings culture. And again, we have a number of items that were spoken about in the budget, but I get the look. So I will save those for when we are taking questions, and maybe I'll get an opportunity to elaborate some more. But these are some of the things just to give you some things to think about based on the budget delivery. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Conrad. I think we all appreciate the manner in which we are now able to see how the budget impacts upon us, and to emphasize this need for long-term planning. And I think that's what we need to start addressing as what the budget is supposed to fulfill. It is a process, it is not an end product, and we tend to anticipate the budget as an end product because we wait to hear what the government is going to do for us rather than become involved in the process of telling the government what we want to be done and how we want it to be done. I think the presentations also highlight this need that Dr. Seerattan spoke of for expenditure efficiency. We have recognized that throwing money at a problem does not solve it. And we need to highlight the reasons why and the shortcomings and overcome those shortcomings, because in many cases you have economies with smaller growth rates, with lower levels of GDP per capita that have higher education levels, better quality of life. What are those factors contributing outside of GDP? So let's continue the discussion. I would like to invite members of our audience to pose questions to our panelists. We would invite questions in rounds of, I would say, 3, and have the panelists respond, and then we would invite another set of questions, as the case may be. We have floating mics, so please, by show of hand.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rukiah Scott, and I'm a Year 1 economics student. So I don't think there's any debate about government come, government go, nothing changes. I think we know that. So my question is, as economists, as experts in the field, we've been going around in circles year after year, every budget. It was Vision 2020, now it's Vision 2030, and it seems as though we just moved from what we had in Vision 2020 and we put it into 2030 because they have not been achieved. And so my question, as experts in the field, what is that one thing that needs to change in order to get our macroeconomic goals fulfilled? Because we've been seeing year after year, we recommend certain changes would have been implemented, and still the results aren't achieved. So again, what is that one thing? Is it that the system? Because if we have a poor foundation, no matter what type of bricks we put on it, it's still going to crumble. So is it our system of governance need to change? The system of the market that we operate in, this mixed market that we operate in, do we need to move to a free or a command? What would you recommend that fundamentally needs to change in order to achieve our macroeconomic goals? Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions at this moment? At the front.
Thank you. Good afternoon again. Rudolph, I've been to either every single post-budget presentation, even the one they had here night before, and I've listened to every single post-budget panel because it's part of what I do at the IFC. And I want to congratulate this evening's panel because I think what you were able to do in the way you presented and discussed the budget, many of your colleagues and others have not been able to do, and there's been very pedantic discussion about the budget, so thank you for that. Coming out of that, though, I have two quick questions for each of the panelists. For Dr. Regan, if you had, based on your expertise and your colleagues' inputs, to identify priority industries which should be earmarked for FDI, what would the top three be? Because we sometimes hear about 7 pillars, 12 pillars. We want to do everything at the same time. What would be the top three? And aligned to that, what type of development incentives or regulations do you think we should also look at as low-hanging fruit to encourage investment in those three sectors? For Dr. Suraj, sorry? Seerattan, apologies. Do you believe that the demand for foreign exchange is largely driven by the consumers in the economy? And if so, what proportion for necessities versus like luxury goods? And a more complicated question. I heard your position loudly and clearly on the IMF, but of course there are countervailing positions across the world. Jamaica, for example, people are now using that to show that IMF plans are successful. Dr. Prasad at Court spoke about IMF and Barbados. Could you explain for us a little bit more? Why do you think then, based on what you posited just now, the IMF would so strongly suggest foreign exchange controls if what you are showing to us is that it is difficult to manage, and what would be the conditionalities or the context then in which the IMF is making these recommendations? Because we need to understand that. If they're so wrong, where's their headspace? And Dr. Conrad, it is certainly a tragedy what you said about the spatial plan, because I visited Frisco, Texas many years ago, and there was a plan they put up on the board which was exactly the size of those two screens, and they could tell you in 20 years' time where the schools would be, where the natural gas pipelines would be running, etc., etc. But my questions to you would be, politicians, you said, understand the mindset of the electorate. So what does that say about us as citizens? What would be your comment if one were to say to you that if the politicians actually did what was right, because all the intelligence is right here in this room, that we, the citizens, might frown upon it and vote them out or prevent them from implementing? How do we get around that? And again, aligned with that, as an economist, what innovation model should we look at as a country that you might recommend? Because I know Mary King once looked at the innovation diamond, Botiwari suggested another model, but is there something you suggest we should look at so that we as civil society can help you to push that forward? So those would be my questions for the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. So with two contributions, I've recorded 5 questions in total. So I would like to address those questions to the panel before we take another round of questioning. So just to remind you, the first question looked at the requirements to instigate this change in order to achieve our macroeconomic goals. Are they economic in nature? Are they institutional in nature? Are they political? What must be done for us to move out of the system of making the same mistakes over and over? Secondly, Dr. Deonanan was asked about the priority in industries for attracting FDI, 3 in particular, and what type of developmental incentives can attract FDI. For Dr. Seerattan, questions on the forex demand, were posed looking at the nature of foreign exchange demand, and as well as that, you were asked to basically suggest why the IMF is such a strong advocate for foreign exchange flexibility, even though experiences have been negative. For Dr. Conrad, we are asking you to look at how the mindset of the citizens affect political behavior, and I may also suggest vice versa. How does the politicians' behavior affect the mindset of the citizens? And finally, what innovation model would you suggest for moving forward and developing and institutionalizing a spatial development plan? So let's start with Dr. Deonanan.
Are you hearing me? Yes. Okay, Rukaya, thank you for the question. Her question was, what one thing would you change to help you to achieve those types of objectives? Difficult question, and a question that I've actually spent a lot of time asking myself. Very, very important question. There are different thoughts on it. You know, people talk about political reform, for instance, because the politics is intricately. We're talking economics here, but economics is only as good as you have it being instituted. That's the politics. What determines the politics are investors, funders. So they are a major critical factor in the landscape of changing things. And then there's us, the electorate, that needs to be educated and sensitive to understand what changes need to be made and have the willpower to try to see them through, among many different things. So there are many different thoughts, but the one thing, what I think, and in reading and trying to grapple with that idea, I think ultimately my humble view, is that what we need is freedom. Freedom. And the freedom I'm referring to is economic freedom. And I'll give you an example. I don't know how many of you guys have heard or know of the case of Mauritius, for instance. And Mauritius is a small country. If you look at the characteristics of Mauritius, very similar to our country in terms of population size, in terms of diversity, same system of education, all those kind of things. And Mauritius, the difference with Mauritius is that they didn't have oil, they didn't have energy. So starting back in the 60s, where we were starting way up here in terms of the GDP ladder, they were much lower down. But if you look at, this is an economy that was forced to develop without energy resources being available. And they have managed to do that. When you look at their growth path, they've had periods of successive increases, something that is to be admired in the landscape of developmental economics. And the thought for why that economy, for instance, is able to develop without all energy resources and all these other types of things, why it's able to develop is because they had to implement good planning, and because the way that they could implement good planning was to free up agents within society that they didn't have to. The thought is that they didn't depend on the energy sector and all the institutional quality issues that come and surround that dependence on the energy sector, because citizens had the freedom to think, because their jobs, because their livelihoods, because different things did not depend on their relationships with individuals in that sector, then they could make good choices. They could elect better governments. Now, many of the problems that we still have in terms of doing business and political inefficiencies, they still have it. But that economy is still growing and growing at a fantastic rate. It's projected that they may even overtake us, and we started much further ahead as a country with a lot more resources. So I think it comes down to economic freedom, freedom of a people to make good decisions, and we need to institute, and we prioritize allowing people to have that freedom, which is also where my talk is coming from. Foreign direct investment, sustainable jobs is a mechanism, a means, just one, of helping to achieve that freedom that would now propel better decision making, not from government to anybody, but from us, because government ultimately is supposed to come from us. To answer the question that I have here, again, These are really difficult questions you guys are asking, but very important and very good questions. I think you should join the research team because that is an active area of research right now. Colleagues and myself and some of our grad students are involved in a paper where we're looking at specific areas of comparative advantage as a basis for sectors that we can develop a niche market in. But for the purpose, well, at this moment right now, I can tell you, and it was really the last point that I was making on my slides there, I think the renewable energy sector is something that we have to give priority focus to. We have to give priority focus when we look at domestic factors. We are among the highest energy consumption in the region. And so we need to grapple with that in terms of our own energy security. We are one of the highest emitters of pollution in the region. I mean, when you look at the graph, Trinidad and Tobago, we are up here, and the entire rest of the region is down here in terms of emission over time. So collectively, the region. So for those very personal reasons, we need to grapple with instituting and developing our renewable energy capacity. Certainly, there are opportunities as well to go beyond that to talking about exporting. And as the technology comes on board in terms of storage, capture, and transitioning, selling to different types of markets, we don't want to be a latecomer in this. The technology is still being developed right now. And I think that it will be, I mean, given the speed, the rate at which the sector is developing. We don't want to wait until that type of technology comes on board. Other players, even in the region here, countries like Barbados, countries like Jamaica, are instituting and developing different types of renewable energy projects. These are costly projects. These are time-sensitive projects. They also require a lot of time to develop and to implement. So if we wait until these technologies come on stream, we're way too late. So for personal reasons, in terms of energy consumption, pollution, but also the geopolitical location of Trinidad and Tobago, I mean, we've been fortunate as well not to have different types of climate change activities going on here. So for a number of reasons, I think this is a tremendously important sector, and that something that we should be investing in. Also, in terms of mopping up the talent pool that we have, in terms of our graduates and the skills that we have or that we can retrain. This is also a sector that we can, I don't want to say easily, but something certainly that we can look towards transitioning our labor towards. And this is, I think, in my opinion, a sector that is going to be on the global landscape for a long time to come. It's a necessity. You have countries like India and China who have, in their legislation, have proposals to cut public transportation reliance on fossil fuels by half by 2030. So we are seeing these things happening. The world is transitioning over to renewable sources. And for many reasons, I think we need to do that for ourselves as well. We can talk about the other ones as the research comes out. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Deonanan. I would like to move to Dr. Seerattan, who can also contribute to the question on what has to change to achieve macroeconomic goals, and also in terms of the question on the foreign exchange demand and the IMF policies.
Okay, the young lady in the back asked a very important question. I think in our context, and indeed in the context of the Caribbean, the one thing that has to change is to develop a culture of value for money in government circles. And everything else will flow from that. Because the government in the Caribbean countries have such a large footprint, whatever the government does, how efficient they operate, that is going to have a significant impact on the economy. If you had a well-developed culture of value for money, simple things like transparency, accountability, trying to avoid waste, trying to avoid corruption, all these things would flow from this culture of value for money. Sometimes when you have discussions and you ask the Minister of Education, for example, what he's doing about the amount of students who don't have books and so on, he will tell you, well, you know, we spent $50 million more on buying school books for students and so on. But he has never a discussion about what you're getting for the money. And even in this budget debate, the minister talked about how much money he will spend on a number of different things, but a lot of the not a lot of discussion on what we actually getting for this money. So this is all tied up with the whole culture of value for money. If we had a well-developed culture of value for money, as we have in some other developing countries, you will see a much better outcomes in terms of not only macroeconomic stability, but better outcomes in terms of growth and so on. A lot of the problems that we have encountered over the years, when you look at it, is because various administration wasted resources, and in many respects, they came to think of the resources that they control as their own, but it is really the taxpayers' money. And so therefore, in the Caribbean and in Trinidad and Tobago in particular, I think if you want to solve many of the problems that we face in the public sphere, we have to develop this culture of value for money, which is something that is now emerging. So, for example, there's a lot of focus now on things like performance budgeting. There's a lot of, the Minister of Finance mentioned the fact that the World Bank is helping them develop a framework for evaluating the efficiency with which they spend money in various sectors and what they get for it and so on. So there is some movement in that area, but we have to go a long way before we could get to a state where it is entrenched, and therefore all these wonderful things that we talked about in terms of accountability and transparency and things come naturally to our public officers and politicians. In terms of the demand for foreign exchange, most economists have concluded that a lot of the problems we face in terms of the foreign exchange market and the excess demand for foreign exchange has to do with speculative activity. So some of my colleagues have mentioned the fact that some of their associates, as a routine, go into the commercial banks every day and see if they can get 200 US, even though they don't need 200 US dollars. And the logic behind that is that when they actually need 200 US, they mightn't be able to get it, right? So the problem, therefore, is that there is speculative activity about the supply of the foreign exchange, right? And once that is on a widespread enough scale, you're going to have the kinds of problems that you see in the foreign exchange market in terms of demand scarcity and the scarcity of supply. No matter how much money the central bank pumps into the system, if you don't deal with that speculative activity and the hoarding activity, you're not going to be able to deal with the problem. That is why it's so foolish to even contemplate talking about using the exchange rate to rebalance supply and demand, because in a market which is characterized by hoarding, by mania, by panic, the price signal does not work. If you use it, it is going to cause more problems than you had before, right? So that is the thing there on the speculative activity. And there are things you could do about it. The things you could do about it is to make the foreign exchange availability more predictable, right? You could also ensure that you incentivize people to hold more Trinidad and Tobago dollar-denominated securities and TT dollars, and the way you could do that is by adjusting the rate of return on TT dollar as opposed to US dollar. So having an interest rate policy where the returns on TT dollar deposits is actually lower than the returns on US dollar-denominated deposits, then it makes sense to go and demand foreign exchange and put it in a US dollar-denominated saving account. And that just snowballs and adds to things. So we have a system that have incentivized speculative activity and hoarding, which has been driven by the kind of fundamental economic problems we have in terms of loss of energy earnings. But there are many policy things that you could do to change around and incentivize or disincentivize people hoarding, right? The other thing is that you mentioned was the whole example of the IMF and its advice on exchange rate policy. The first thing you have to know is the IMF have made a lot of mistakes. If you my students who do international money and finance, I always make the point that the IMF is not infallible. They have made numerous mistakes across the globe. If you've studied how the IMF advise different countries and different policies and so on, there are numerous examples where they have made mistakes. Even in Trinidad and Tobago in 1986, when we were in a fund adjustment program, we would have moved the exchange rate, I think from, it was 2 point something to 4 point something, but the fund was recommending that we move from 2 to 10, I believe it was. If you talk to people who was involved in the negotiations then, right? So that's one. The second thing is that the theoretical foundation for the fund adjustment program is completely flawed, right? If you look, students here should go and look. There are actual documents that outline the theoretical foundations of the fund structure adjustment program, which is based on a demand management kind of framework. They say nothing about the supply side. They speak nothing about speculative activity, and therefore, if you have a flawed analytical framework for the basis of your policy, then I would have serious questions about accepting your advice, especially on the exchange rate, and especially in the context of we having our experience here in both Guyana and Jamaica about what not to do. Okay, so that's the reason why I think, as to why the IMF would continue to advocate, for example, a more flexible exchange rate policy and the dependence more on the exchange rate for adjustment. It could be because they are wedded to a particular ideological and analytical framework. And if you can't defend yourself in terms of bringing to the fore evidence and an analytical framework that says the opposite, then you will get railroaded into going the way of the fund. Now, we have much better intellectual resources today than we would have had in the 1980s and so on. So we have a lot of bright economists in the Ministry of Finance and at the central bank who could argue with the best of the people at the level of the International Monetary Fund. So we are better served in that respect. And many of these people are actually graduates from the Department of Economics here, right? So I think part of it is because of this ideological dependence on this analytical framework that is flawed, and many people have admitted it. It's also because sometimes they don't understand the intricacies of how these economies function. Because if you look at the fund, the people who come down from the fund, sometimes they have people fresh out of university with a PhD, and they think they know how to advise different countries on developing and so on, right? So I'm not saying it's because the fund economists are not fit for purpose. I'm just saying that once we understand how our economies function, we should not take advice which we know not to be in our best interest. Okay?
Thank you, Dr. Seerattan. Dr. Conrad, I would like to invite you to address again the same question in terms of your opinion about why and what changes are necessary for us to achieve our macroeconomic and, by extension, developmental goals, as well as the question on the mindset of the citizens as well and the innovation model required.
Well, we can sit here and pontificate about what systems need to change, what systems need to be redesigned, but really and truly we just need to take a look in the mirror. We need to change our mindset in our own space. We tend to be model citizens everywhere except at home. So we need to change our mindset in terms of how we treat with our own country and, by extension, the region. Because no matter what we do, at the end it amounts to what we as individuals and how we treat with and respect our space or lack thereof. And that answers the same question in terms of the governments may see the need to do something but understand that we're short-sighted. But we're not short-sighted. We know what needs to be done as a collective. But we also need to do these things both individually but collectively. A lot of change came about as a result of peaceful mobilization of large groups. And if you do that historically in the United States and in India, a lot of change was brought about by that. So yes, we can advocate for what needs to be done because we all know what needs to be done and we can all have that mindset change. And I'm glad that you mentioned the site to speak to the issue of the spatial development. Again, that's a mindset issue. We need to change with how we treat with our space. And understand that what we do has a direct impact on not just our future, but the future of generations to come. For example, in the budget, I know I heard mention of smart cities, and my eyes opened wide, because I'm thinking, okay, where do we go from here with the smart cities? Because if we look to Singapore, buildings are designed in Singapore based on airflow and sunlight exposure. So you optimize the airflow and the exposure to the sunlight, so you reduce the amount of artificial lighting you use, and you optimize on the winds that flow through instead of using air conditioning. I mean, as a matter of fact, I travel throughout the region, and I hear that Trinidad is often referred to as the air-conditioned capital. So we definitely consume a lot of energy. We don't think of it primarily because it is subsidized, and I think that that's one of the things we need to think about, is a removal of some of these subsidies. And again, because and I use the example of bottled water during an impending hurricane or bad weather system. There's a reason. People call it price gouging, but it ensures that we use the water efficiently. If the price goes from, let's say, $12 a bottle to $20 a bottle, or maybe $50 a bottle, we will not waste a drop of that water because we know the value of the water. But we don't pay much for it, so we don't understand the value. So all of that, again, it amounts to mindset. So again, those are some of the things that we need to change. By way of innovation, what do we need to do by way of a paradigm or a framework? Well, we need to go back to the fundamentals again. We have ideas. We have people with great ideas. I go to a lot of what they call them, the green markets and the craft fairs. See a lot of innovation. But our problem sometimes can be our antiquated legislation. For example, I spoke to went to this fair right here on this campus and saw cocoa rum. The problem is bringing cocoa rum into production to export, because we have the best cocoa. We boast about that. That's all we boast about. We don't talk about how we can optimize that. But we have this rum that we cannot get to the export market because of some of our antiquated legislative frameworks. So we need to start with some of the fundamentals before we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Conrad. I would like to encourage participants to pose one last round of questions so that the panelists can respond and offer some closing remarks. Are there any questions? Dr. Lafourcade?
Thank you, panelists, and thank you, panelists. I quite enjoyed the presentations. I listened to contributions before the speculations before the budget and various contributions following the budget. And I could tell you that this afternoon I got some new insights, and I appreciated that. In terms of Dr. Conrad, you mentioned, I believe, looking in the mirror pertaining to certain things. And as the panel presented, there were times when it took me back to thinking that we have a country where for more than 3 decades we have basically been voting out governments. So many people would not really know of periods when we would have had a long-stay government. For about 33 years, we have been doing that. And not necessarily getting perhaps the changes that we would want. And as I heard from the panel, I thought, perhaps it may have something to do with the fact that we remain the same. It's us. It's us. So that we might be looking for change. And so this is a comment in some ways along with a question. How do we mentioned mass mobilization and so on. But how do you get at that? When, for example, one of the things I heard, I think it may have been Dr. Conrad, mentioned the CPEP and the URP, and perhaps increases in that. And we know of the challenges there. But if we have in other areas, we have public servants, we have UE workers, we have whatever, and we all want increases in whatever remuneration we are getting. If we hear that we are not getting those increases, we are a little upset. So it may be that even in terms of the CPEP, the URP, maybe they also want. And I wondered, what do you think in terms of that? I also, in terms of Dr. Conrad, you mentioned the challenge pertaining to the way in which we conceptualize things, including housing and the government's role in the provision and subsidization of housing. And again, maybe I'm wavering here because I agree with you and I understand, but I want you to maybe clarify a bit for me. Because again, while a house, it's private, it's a private property or so, and we could argue for why the individual and whatever must provide that and not the state. It's the same with certain kinds of healthcare and education. But when we speak to basic education, basic healthcare, basic access to certain services, and basic shelter, then perhaps we do have a role at certain levels for the state to provide. So I would want to hear a little clarification there. In terms of Dr. Deonanan, I agreed in terms of what was happening with the numbers, the absolute numbers in terms of the unemployment. But that presentation got me thinking, is it that and it came back to my first thing with Dr. Conrad here, I wondered, is it that we are having challenges, all of us, as researchers, understanding the society and the economy in which we are living, and even operating and working, and even the individuals in the society having some challenges understanding ourselves. Because we are in a region where we know that we have among the lowest levels of the unemployment rate. But we do know that if we ask certain questions, and maybe it is the sustainable employment that you are talking, and jobs that you got out there, because we know that if we pose questions to individuals, they will then indicate that in terms of their hardships, and they find that they cannot get jobs and so on, and the challenges there. So I wondered again, what is going wrong there with those numbers where we could stand neck and neck across the world, but we are still, from what we hear on the ground from individuals, there are those challenges. In terms of the FDI and the learning from doing, there are benefits to that, substantial benefits. But we have also had, what do we do to reap those benefits? Because the history has shown that we have had experiences where we have not capitalized on that learning from doing component that you mentioned in terms of the benefits of the FDI. Just a comment, I will close, but just a comment. In terms of the LED, you mentioned that, and we have the potential for substantial savings in terms of conservation and in terms of expenses on the household. I will tell you, I did a little thing, I think it was last year. And of course it will vary from household to household. And it may depend on the different things. But I saw where just by changing out what we had as those energy-saving lights and whatever to LED, that you immediately got, I got a 30% decrease in my electricity bill. But when I listened to the budget, I wondered, how are we going to market this, to educate, to convince people that it might be worthwhile? Because we might very well have some opportunities, but depending on how we don't sell it or how we don't transmit it, people could not reap the benefits of it. In terms of the Revenue Authority, Dr. Seerattan, you mentioned the Revenue Authority, and I heard things pertaining to tax compliance and efficient collection of taxes. And it got me wondering in terms of, is it, again, that part of, and you mentioned the opportunities, the leakages that we need to be, in terms of capture of the taxes and so. I wondered, okay, but if the way in which people are earning income even, that is changing. We have a lot of e-commerce and so on taking place. If the way in which people might be earning might be changing, it may not even be that the challenge now is about how do you capture from, be it the taxi drivers, whatever, but from others. And it's linked to, I think, to the foreign exchange and the challenges there, because of the way in which business people are earning income and spending. And if we cannot find ways, perhaps, to tailor the tax collection mechanisms to capture, then we could continue to have challenges. We could be using some old thinking and systems when the younger ones may, or the world may have been going ahead of us. So it's how do we capture in that changing environment, where many people who may even be sitting in the room here with us, the way in which they do business is that after they do whatever is the formal thing, they go and they do something else, and they might be earning an income of 20-something, 30-something thousand or more per year via different electronic means, and we never capture that. I want to say something on the minimum wage, and this will be the last comment. When I do a rough calculation, just rough, I may have it a little, I may be a little off. But when I do a rough calculation in terms of, and I think this is under Dr. Conrad, I have this. When I do a rough calculation with the minimum wage, I'm seeing where if we have an increase from 15 to 17.50 per hour, then we are talking about moving from about 120 to 140 a day. In reality, I believe that again, interacting in different spheres and so on, people might be paying somewhere between $25 to $31 minimum to individuals, which amounts to about $200 to $250 per day. Now, there are implications, yes. I know when you have, depending on the number of people you have employed, then that could impact on the bottom line. It could make people make adjustments. But right now, because that minimum wage is not what people might be dealing with in many cases, you are instead paying somewhere between $200 to $250. It may be that what may kick in might be people wanting to do a bit of substitution more. Because then you may have a pressure to move a bit up to maintain a gap. And the substitution may come, it is alleged, it may come from the availability of workers with a different kind of attitude. And if those workers with a different kind of attitude, if they have their papers, it is in order and so on, then I think that is where a challenge for the locals, the nationals and so on, may come in. Just a comment again.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Lafourcade. So we have quite a lot of issues to respond to and to address. With that, I would like to ask one final time if there are any other questions before going back to the panel. Okay. So I would start with the questions directed to Dr. Conrad. From Dr. Lafourcade, looking at the issues raised in terms of CPEP and URP changes in their wages and their desire then for betterment. So how is it that these changes are going to affect them? And connected to that as well, I think the questions in generally spoke to social spending, whether it be on housing, health, or education. Dr. Lafourcade was really asking for Dr. Conrad to elaborate on his comments with regard to how these types of spending affect poor people, how they affect lower income households, and what then is the true role of the government, if not to facilitate the well-being of lower income households. Dr. Conrad?
Thank you, Dr.
Try the other.
All right, yeah. Thank you, Dr. Lafourcade, for the comments and questions. Very interesting. I would start with talking a bit about the whole issue of the URP workers, the URP and CPET gangs. And that's directly tied to some of the other issues. But one of the things which takes me back to the mindset is that we have a large number of, well, not a large number, but we have relatively strong labor movements which represent various groups of workers, which are in constant negotiations with the government, which sometimes end up in the industrial court. We have tutor who have been clamoring that they have had no real wage increases for the last 4 years. We have some groups advocating that wage increases in the period before still have not been settled. We have some negotiations which have been settled, but the back payments have not been made. And here now we have, coming out of that, the increases. So given the mindset, moving forward, that would become the absolute minimum for entering wage negotiations, which would be a 15% raise, given the mindset. I think that is one of the dangerous outcomes that may result from that. And then again, we are talking about the wage increases. That's why I question the motivation for the increase. Is it linked to productivity? So I think we need to have a different system or switch into a merit-based pay where we're rewarded for productivity rather than for making noise. I also, in terms of the issue of housing, have to be very careful with it. Now, again, we know that there are a large number of benefits, both social and economic, to be derived from the provision of housing. The question is then, what is our framework for the delivery of affordable housing? Right now, now there's been talk about the public-private partnerships, but in reality, we have the government becoming a provider of housing to address the issue of housing affordability for the general population. And that in itself can create problems. So there has to be an enabling framework that will include all of the stakeholders. I mentioned in particular, for example, the issue of land. And we have the Land Settlement Agency. And the Land Settlement Act means that all of these informal settlements over time will be regularized. And so we have a large group of persons who will then have land available to them. So, and again, that does not address the issue of affordable housing. But that in itself should be part of the package. So, for example, we know we have the informal settlements, and it's a dangerous place to be in terms of making a decision. So we're talking about regularize the informal settlements, and not just regularizing the informal settlements. The government goes a step further. After regularizing the informal settlements, these are people who have occupied state lands for a long term. They regularize the squatters, then they provide infrastructure, drainage, road networks, electricity, potable water. All of these things are then provided after you regularize the squatters. Once that is complete, you come back now and you provide them with a subsidy to improve their homes. So that can be one element of the solution. But we have to be careful, because then that sends a signal: take a piece of land, wait until your turn comes, you will get regularized, you'll get everything. So we have to be very, very careful. But in some countries, that enabling environment means that housing takes the form of all of the stakeholders coming together to address the issue, not just the government. So the government has its part to play by way of an intervention, but it should not be that the government becomes the provider of housing. You referenced education, for example. The government is responsible for providing education up to a certain level, after which it should be a private endeavor. We have the example of the early childhood education. That's not when the government should intervene. The government should intervene at a later stage. The primary school is a legal mandate. We have to be careful with that. So then secondary school, okay, fine. But beyond that, it should become a collective where all of the stakeholders are involved in providing for this. For example, we provide education with the expectation that individuals will become more productive, and the private sector benefits directly. So the private sector has a large stake in the provision of education at the tertiary level, not just wait until the person comes out of the tertiary institution and then begins to work. And that speaks to a whole number of issues. Now, we talked about how do people begin to change our mindset. Milton Friedman said, for people to change their mindset, it starts with the curriculum in schools. We have inherited a curriculum, an education system that was designed for a specific purpose, and we continue with that system. In Caribbean Education, a book that I read, the education system was designed to indoctrinate persons. It was introduced by the colonials to indoctrinate persons, to make them think a certain way so that we would not retaliate against their imposed authority. We still work with that system, rather than change the curriculum and design one to create individuals who are more creative, more innovative in their thinking. So we have to think about the curriculum, the intended design, the intention of the design of the curriculum, go back to the drawing board, think about what we want our human capital to look like, what we want the citizens to look like, and then design a curriculum that speaks to that, rather than continue with an inherited one that indoctrinates persons to a large extent.
Thank you, Dr. Conrad. Moving on, I would like to address Dr. Lafoucade's question to Dr. Deonanan concerning the unemployment measurements, particularly the low rates of unemployment in Trinidad and Tobago, and how it compares to the reality in terms of what we see happening around us. In addition, a question was posed on the requirements that need to be put in place for reaping the benefits of FDI in terms of the knowledge transfer, because according to history, in terms of our experience, what has happened is that we had attracted the foreign investment, but the knowledge transfer seemed to never materialize. Dr. Deonanan?
Thank you for the question, Dr. Lafakad. I think Dr. Lafakad should be on this panel, and I would advocate certainly for her, because these are fantastic ideas, fantastic food for thought, and really good questions. So I hope Dr. Lafakad might consider joining us next year, or whoever the panel is. But that part aside, and me poking fun at Dr. Lafakad, let me start with my favorite question, which is the transfer of FDI and enabling that to happen. And that is a fantastic, fantastic point, because in my presentation, I can tell you that FDI is important, but the literature on development and how development arises out of FDI is much, much larger and much more encompassing than that. Yes, certainly there are factors that are tremendously important. FDI just doesn't enter a country and all of a sudden spills over into things and then make life better. Does not happen. There needs to also be preconditions, things that are put in place for that spillover to happen. One critical factor, for instance, is financial access, a properly working financial sector. You might have, again, if we think through the mechanisms of how this works, investors come in, we get exposed to a new type of technology, we have ideas around it beyond just that particular application. This is the basis for creating new innovative ideas. We figure out a new product, and we can market it somewhere and do all those kind of things, but it needs funding. It needs funding. And the people with the ideas might not necessarily have access to capital in and of themselves. So without the presence of a well-functioning financial sector, for instance, those ideas will never be brought to fruition, or very rarely. So in our context, we have had FDI, and I'm not sure how many opportunities we've had outside of the energy sector to be sufficiently exposed to non-energy sector FDI, so to bring these ideas to fruition. But even if those opportunities have occurred in the past, there might be deficiencies, for instance, in our financial sector as one. This is just one of many things. This is not me picking on the financial sector, for example. But certainly in the absence of those things, you're not going to have that type of knowledge transfer. And then we also have to consider the nature of what the mainstay of this economy is, which is energy. And there's a lot of money to be had in that sector. So when you are also comparing opportunities, you're implicitly comparing opportunities in terms of the energy sector and the lucrative opportunities that might exist for people who have ideas, and they're weighing that against opportunities in the non-energy sector. And then there's a risk associated with those things as well. And so while there might have been learning opportunities, but if the risk isn't sufficiently supported, the environment doesn't support that, then one might take the safer option and go with something in the energy sector that we're accustomed to. These are just some examples. But I take the point, and yes, certainly you're preaching to the choir here, that there are a number of conditions that need to be met. FDI doesn't work by itself. So it's really a two-part process, and this is really underlying. If we are talking about expanding trade, if we're talking about expanding exports, if we are seriously having those discussions, then we also need to have a serious discussion about promoting foreign direct investment in those sectors. And that was the point of my presentation. But yes, the point that I'm taking away here as well, and I agree with, is that you also, alongside with that, you need to have a serious discussion about those critical factors that would enable the spillover effects to take place. In terms of the unemployment, yes, and this is why I chose to highlight to put the historic context through the graph. That you would have seen there that we have made a lot of gains. Foreign direct investment, particularly in the energy sector, sometimes gets, to put it in layman's terms, gets a bad rap. And the reason that happens is because it creates a lot of problems as well in terms of institutional quality and capacity and those different types of things. But in the graph there, we see unemployment numbers, particularly through the boom period, decreasing. And we have made tremendous gains coming out of that resource FDI. So we've been able to benefit from it. But what we see in more recent times, though, is that yes, we haven't, our unemployment levels in terms of numbers certainly are not what they used to be, and we need to be proud of that. But we also have to be mindful that we're not turning and we're not reverting. The unemployment numbers now might be in par with around what was it there in 2007, still in the decline period when we're declining. But we're looking at numbers now that something that we achieved back in 2000, 2007, 2008. And so those unemployment numbers are rising. But it's not just the numbers. It's not just about providing jobs. Because when you have conversations with people that are employed in the public sector or private sector or different types of places, it's also the quality of the environment and their jobs and their tenure within there as well. For instance, many organizations are well-educated individuals as well, and education did not hedge against this risk, but they have contracts. They have contracts that limit their ability to make and to voice their opinions in a free way that enhance the job environment. And what anecdotally, in talking to different individuals from different organizations, and I certainly don't offer that as what is happening in the landscape, but I'm saying there are stories out there where contracts have been reduced, for instance, from what used to be 3-year contracts to 1 year to 1 month. And we've seen that happening over the last few years. So yes, we could have a conversation about numbers in terms of the numbers being low. But I think alongside with that as well, you have to, we also have to have a conversation about sustainability of jobs as well, and where that concept is coming from. And this is intricately related as well to the point and the question that I admire that Rukaya asked at the beginning, which is, how do we change the economy? How do we change things? And this is also related to the point that Dr. Conrad is making about looking at ourselves and the basis for innovation. My opinion is that you need freedom. And when you don't have sustainable employment because of numbers being reduced, but also because the environment doesn't allow you to have that freedom to exercise your skills and thought processes, because of the nature of employment being changed in different ways that would derail against that, then the act of looking at ourselves, agents respond to incentives. We respond to the risks around us, and we are impinged in expressing that freedom that would underlie innovation and changes within our processes.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Deonanan. Last but certainly not least, I would like to invite Dr. Seerattan to offer a comment on the question of the challenges for revenue capture given the changes in the ways in which incomes are being earned and spent. How do we capture in this changing environment these types of revenues that exist? Dr. Seerattan.
Okay, just to make the point that the Revenue Authority is not something that is being recommended in isolation. The Revenue Authority is part of the tax reform process where you're focusing on the administrative infrastructure in place for managing the tax system in the country, right? So the thing about the changes in rates and all those technical stuff, there is a very important part that we have tended to ignore in the Caribbean, which is the administrative infrastructure for collecting taxes. And what the Revenue Authority is supposed to do is that we want to refocus the multiple arms of the tax authority in Trinidad and Tobago that is disparate and convoluted and therefore less efficient, to have something that is a central authority and where you have a redeployment of your labor. It may not be that you fire people, right? What we need are more people who are in auditing, because we have a problem with arrears. So, for example, the Minister of Finance in the latest moratorium on taxes, he collected $2.2 billion. The IMF has estimated that our tax arrears is in the realm of $7 billion. That is greater than the fiscal deficit that we have now. So without doing anything in terms of increasing taxes or whatever, we could actually make the difference up in terms of closing that fiscal deficit without taxing anybody else, having any other increased taxes and so on. So it's a very important issue that needs to be dealt with. I know this is a hot political potato because it involves people's tenure and so on, but in the context of the country, we need that restructuring of the tax administration to ensure that more people are in tax auditing and so on, because there's a lot of money to be collected, but the only way you could do that is to audit. And the way you audit, one of the most important information, we should borrow a book from a page from the Americans, with FATCA. The way they collect, FATCA is all about ensuring that high-worth individuals and companies, American companies operating in America and outside, pay their fair share of taxes. And the only way to do that, because we have very innovative bankers and accountants, you have to be able to follow the money. And the way you do that is through the banking system, because at some point, the flows have to enter the banking system at some point. So greater dependence on audit, change up your structure of your tax system, tax administration system, where more people are in auditing, and with the necessary training in terms of how you do audits and so on, and tying in the banking information so you could track down these dollars and so on. Because, as I said before, if we continue to operate as we do now, a lot of people, especially high-worth individuals and people who own their own businesses, they get away with virtually paying no tax, right? And we have a very generous public subsidy system, as you all know, in terms of education, in terms of health and so on. So the fact that these people are well-to-do, the fact that these people don't pay their fair share of taxes is not only an efficiency issue, but it's an equity issue, right? So that is the logic of why this revenue authority is so very important for Trinidad and Tobago. And just to make a point about the FDI, we shouldn't be so negative. If you ever in Barbados around August, and you pass through the airport in Barbados, you see a whole set of trainees coming back from Saudi, from the Gulf states and so on. And these are people who are in the petroleum services industry. And they go all over the world. They are part of Trinidad and Tobago Petroleum Services Company. And people from all over the world hire them. And that is because they have these skills built up. And you know, my petroleum engineering friend will tell me, if you could find oil in Trinidad, with our very convoluted geology, you could find oil anywhere else, right? So we have actually benefited a lot from this technology transfers from our operating in different sectors and so on. But I agree that it should be better. But in today's world, where people are trying to protect their intellectual capital, they are very, very averse to sharing the more sensitive areas of knowledge and technology and so on. So that's always going to be a very difficult thing to manage. But it because of the highly educated nature of the Trinidad and Tobago population, we have an advantage in terms of being able to benefit from these technology transfers and so on. So I don't think we should be that negative about our performance so far.
Thank you, Dr. Seerattan. So we are now in a time deficit because we have utilized more than our allocated time for this evening's discussion. But let's not let it end here. We look forward to your support at continued panels, at continued events that department hosts throughout the year, which, you know, brings up these issues and invites your contributions and invites the contributions of distinguished panelists, such as these gentlemen we have here. So with that, I would like to thank our panelists for their contributions and for their insights. I would like to thank the members of our audience, those who remained with us from court and those who came despite the heavy rainfall. Once again, have a good evening and thank you for being here.